Okay, here we are, episode number 2, and I am actually starting it off in some tears. And if I'm being fully transparent and honest, I've been wanting to record the second episode, honestly, since I uploaded the first one. I've had so much excitement. I've had so much confirmation, so many signs and signals that this is something I really want to do. And then every time it would come down to me recording, I would have some sort of a imposter syndrome or a voice inside my head tell me why it's not a good idea. And a lot of those excuses had to do with my kids. I mentioned last episode I have 3 little girls, and the youngest of which is still breastfeeding, by the way, and 7 months old. And a little TMI, but I also started my period this week. Maybe that's why I'm crying. But I haven't done that with my other girls while I'm breastfeeding. Usually it comes after. And so I feel like my emotions are kind of up in, like being upheaved while I'm going through this some exciting changes, this podcast, this video series included. And I think I dissected where the fear is coming from because I actually called a really, really good friend of mine, my best friend. She's not in my area, and so we talk on the phone. We Marco Polo a lot. And I called her and I was doing deep breaths, kind of like how I started out my last episode. I was doing these deep, deep breaths, and then all of a sudden I had all this emotion coming to the surface, and I realized it's because I have this idea that what I have to say isn't deserving of an audience. It won't carry weight with an audience. Or I think there's also a deeper fear of allowing love in. And it's kind of crazy. About a few weeks ago, I was in a crystal shop and I was buying something for my sister that was really important to me, and I was also in an emotional state, which is funny because this does not happen that often as it kind of is sounding like it does. I don't even remember the last time I cried, and so I really needed this today. A lot of releasing just happened, and I was getting emotional in this shop because I love giving gifts, okay? I love thinking of a person, thinking of what would light them up, or something that reminds me of them, or something that maybe subconsciously they don't even know makes people think of them, and giving them a really thought out gift. And that's what I was doing. And they have this little bowl of affirmations that you can pull from. And I was talking with the girl, we were chatting, and she helped me pick out what I was purchasing. And we were both just kind of giggling, and because I was emotional but happy. And she goes, "Why don't you pull one for her and for you?" And I wasn't planning on pulling one for me. I wasn't there for me that day. And what I pulled was something along the lines of, allow yourself to let love in. And it hit me different that day because I tend to love on people really deeply, especially giving them gifts is one way I show them I love them. And I tend to put myself on the back burner, which I'm sure a lot of you can relate to that. But it's almost like a way of avoidance for me. And I'm just now piecing this together. Just this last week with this friend that I Marco Polo, we do a lot of out loud processing together to clear things out so it doesn't fester. It doesn't live on and maybe grow, kind of like a little fungus in our mind, I guess. And it was such a small, little thought, this little affirmation, but it actually prompted that my disassociation with loving on other people is a way that I ignore loving on myself, and that I actually have a really hard time believing in myself or loving myself. And there's obviously some emotion here. And I kind of have an analogy for this, and I don't know if any of you can relate, but I did kind of an experiential training last year. And one of the exercises someone gave me this metaphor for how they saw my inner talk, and it hit me like, the analogy I have for this is it literally hit me like light piercing through my soul. I had never felt so seen with someone not even knowing me before. And it like literally shocked me because I had gone through at that time, so maybe it was 2 years ago because I was 28. I'd gone through 28 years of my life like not realizing how to articulate what my inner voice sounds like, or that I even really have one. You know, like that inner dialogue that kind of implants doubt potentially, or maybe pumps us up sometimes. Like it looks different for everyone, but for me, someone said, and I'm going to swear here, I swear often, and I am just going to be candid. And where my swearing comes from, I will say, is like when I feel something really deep, for some reason, I feel the need to also express it with like the gravity of a word that like equates to its depth, if that makes sense. But this was said to me. And so I am quoting, but he looked at me, and I am a ball baby. Again, wow, we're talking about a lot of tears here, which again, this is 2 years ago, okay? But I had been just like cracked open like an egg, like feeling so seen, so exposed, so vulnerable for like the first time probably ever in my life, where like the focus was really, really on me and me having to look at me, not other people even looking at me. Like I had to dig deep and look at me. And he looks at me and he stares at me like straight into my eyes, like this piercing light. And he says, something, 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 something. And you have your fucking beat up stick out every single day, and you are just wailing on yourself over and over and over and over. And I remember just being like, I felt it. Like, and then when that light pierced through me of just being like, whoa, like I beat myself to a freaking pulp daily. And I remember going home after this and now having this awareness that I had this voice inside my head that was so cruel. I started to try to voice this out, like, and it started out by me just trying to explain this to my husband, because I would come home and I would just tell him like what I learned, right? And I tried to articulate this to him, and he was like, well, what do you mean? And I was like, oh, do I have some examples for you? Like just this morning. And I went into how I felt in the morning with like mom guilt. And I was like, it's like literally, and then I was like, oh my gosh, like since I was speaking it out loud, I was like, it's literally every single thing I do. And it was just like this, like heavy, at the same time, like releasing feeling of having the awareness that it's there. So now I can like look at it, but now I know it's there. And it's heavier because it's louder. Whereas before it was like this subconscious thing. Now it's been brought to my conscious, right? And so the mom guilt, the shame I was putting on myself, like no one even needed to shame me or guilt me because I was doing it enough for myself. So starting today and sitting down and recording, that beat up stick was out. And it was freaking out, let me tell you. And it was telling me all the reasons why I shouldn't be doing this. My daughter's downstairs sleeping. She could be waking up at any minute, and telling myself that I shouldn't be recording because she could wake up. And I just took those deep breaths, and honestly, like leaning on community, which is so important for us women. And I don't even think we realize, like in today's society, how important it is to have someone to just simply speak out loud and vocalize what's really in our head. Like to be honest and try our best to voice the concerns or what's troubling us or what's shaming or guilting us, which is so interesting to me because I felt and still feel shame and guilt by expressing myself. I've been told a lot of different things, that it's creating drama, it's being like addicted to drama, that it's bringing negative attention to something. Like there's all these stories about talking about how we feel, and it diminishes how we feel, and then it just lives in there and it festers, right? That fungus analogy is actually pretty good. Like it's like this fungi that's in there, and once it catches hold, like it can grow on pretty much anything, right? And so that's like a really big part of my story, something I'm like constantly working on today. And I tend to, even with my awareness, I tend to disassociate and numb out, and in a lot of different forms. And sometimes it takes me numbing out and disassociating for a really long time, or someone pointing it out to me for me to even notice that I'm doing it. And this shows up in forms of scrolling social media. It shows up in forms of giving myself a break and watching TV and numbing out for a few hours. And then it's funny because I justify the disassociation with self-care. And that's a whole nother tangent I can go on I think that sounds right. About self-care, because I always associated self-care with like plopping into a bath, right? I think I mentioned that last time. And it doesn't look like that for me. And I had to discover that. And so the social media scrolling and the watching shows has really, like, my minutes that I'm giving away in my day to that stuff has really gone down, but not to say without struggle. And now when I do that, it comes from a different energy, and it feels actually really good to just watch a show. But it's funny, I kind of can tell when I'm disassociating versus not now with like watching a show, for example, is I'll watch one and I'll feel okay, and I'll be like, I feel good. Like I all of a sudden will start doing something else. Whereas the disassociating, I can literally binge all day, and every time it's saying next episode and it's like doing the whole loading screen on Netflix or Disney Plus or whatever platform it is, I'm like, should I turn it off? Should I not? Should I? And then it plays and I'm like, oh, well, it already started. So, and then I get into the next episode, right? So that's a big, big piece of who I am and like why I'm here today. Another piece that is kind of correlated with this is the thought of just image being so important, like perfectionism, right? Like I think that word is like really overused, and so it doesn't have like the gravity that it used to have with me. But just showing up with like 110%. And this correlates with production. Like my image is correlated with me producing, or me having credentials of some sort, or tangible physical examples. And that it really comes from a lot of different places. But one place for me in particular, like my story is, I mentioned I am in Utah. I grew up here. I was one of 3, so I only knew 2 other people in my friend group growing up that were not LDS or Mormon. And growing up, that wasn't really something that bothered me, that like I wasn't part of a group. But the people I did know, and not everyone, but some instances that stuck with me, let me give some background now. So let's dive into the background with that, because I think they all tie in with each other. They all have correlation. And so growing up, not being LDS here in Utah, I have very specific memories as like a child, as a young teen, and then also like middle school, high school, like that era of my life where it did impact me, but not the way maybe you would think. And so let's see, the very first memory I have of it impacting me was in elementary school. I remember there was like 3 girls, and they were all linking arms, and they were kind of walking together, and they were like, and then I walked across their path. I think we were at recess, and they were like, we just all found out we're all baptized and we're all Mormon. Are you baptized and are you Mormon? And I remember just being like, no. And they were like, oh, well, we're all Mormon and baptized, so we're best friends. And they're all linking arms, and they walked past me. And I wasn't good friends with these girls, but like they were in my class. I definitely knew who they were. And so I just remember just being like, huh. But that didn't, for me, like as little Sydney, I wasn't like, oh my gosh, I'm not part of the clique or part of the clan, or like I'm being left alone or abandoned. Like it didn't hit me that way. And I think the later stories kind of help explain how it did hit me. So the next story I remember is I had this best friend in middle school. I basically lived at her house. And during the first part of our relationship, I was really close with her parents. And she only had one sibling, but she was younger and wasn't really home. And so like it was like me, this friend, and her parents a lot. And my parents always taught me like do more than you're asked, like be the helper, like always be helping clean up or offer to help. And so I remember one day I stayed for dinner and I was helping with the dishes, and my friend was on the couch with her dad, and the mom looks at me and she's like, "Oh my gosh." So maybe I won't say her name. I kind of said her name already, but this friend told me that you aren't Mormon. And out of all of her friends, I thought for sure you would be Mormon. Like you are so helpful. You're so kind. And I remember, again, my brain just being like, huh. Like the things that were associated with Mormonism to me were confusing because I didn't really have a concept of organized religion because I didn't grow up going to church. My parents taught me a few things because they did grow up going to church. My dad served an LDS mission, a full mission, and they got married in the temple. And they decided to step away from the church when my sister was young. I have an older sister, a younger brother, so I am a middle child. And that's kind of their story to tell. But they did teach me some things because, of course, it was a huge part of who they were. And it was still instilled in who they were and how they wanted to raise us. And that actually kind of leads me into my next example. But let me wrap up that one is I just remember kind of pondering, like, so do I have to be Mormon to be like a good friend or like a good helper? Like I didn't really think beyond that, but again, it just kind of stuck with me as like being confusing. And then the next memory I have is I remember going to primary with one of my girlfriends I was like technically in the ward based off the location. So I guess for any of you guys that aren't familiar with, I guess the Mormon church, I am not the person to explain this, okay? Because I really do not have any foundational knowledge because I never went to church, only as like a guest with friends and like just trying to like see what it's all about, being curious. But where you live, there's certain areas and it's called your ward. And I think they're like sectored off. And when your ward, if you're in a certain ward, you go to a certain church and it's like by location. And so when you move to a new location here, a lot of times people will be like, what ward are you in? And I'm like, I'm not Mormon, kind of a thing. Or they will be like, oh yeah, you're in my ward because you're my neighbor or something. And I won't really have anything to say about that because it doesn't really apply to my life, right? But it's something that gets talked about a lot. So anyways, this story goes about because, so I remember I had fun getting dressed up and like putting on a dress and feeling pretty and going with this friend of mine. And I remember we were sitting around and they were like, okay, now open up your scriptures. We're going to start reading. And I remember this feeling of just being like, oh my gosh, like I have this weird thing not growing up, like reading the Bible or scripture. And it's worded very philosophical, right? My brain cannot comprehend the way that it's written, like the Old Testament, New Testament, like the way that it's written. It just doesn't make sense to my brain, maybe because I didn't grow up. And that was always something I was jealous of too. I remember I had a philosophy class in college, and I do remember my Mormon friends thinking it was so easy. And I'm like, why am I struggling so hard? And then I realized because of a comment a friend made that they're like, well, it just reminds me of like how the Bible's written. Like it's like the same type of writing. And I was like, well, that makes sense because I've never read that and I don't understand that. So they start talking about the three kingdoms of heaven. And again, I am just sharing these stories because they're mine and this was my experience. And I believe this shaped some of my beliefs in myself growing up. I am not saying anything about the Mormon church. I want to make that very clear. I do not judge whether you go to church or you don't. I have friends that are Mormon and that aren't now. And I mean, my parents used to go to church and now they don't. Their families are all still active members. And so, like, I have never felt one way or the other. I've never, like, put any emotions or feelings on members or non-members. Like, that's just never been a thing. Again, I'm getting at how it has affected me, just the culture in general. And that's all, like, that is the reason for me sharing this, is just to paint a picture of my background and how it affected me and where some of that came from. And I think growing up in this culture, especially in the city I grew up in, it's very heavenly. The irony. It's very heavily Mormon. Like I said, I was one of 3 friends, so like only knew 2 friends that weren't LDS, like out of my friend group, which ended up being like pretty large. We had like a really big friend group and then like sub friend groups, I would say. And yeah, out of all of them, they were the only ones I knew. So back to my story, they start talking about the 3 kingdoms of heaven. And the one thing I do remember that my dad always taught me about God in general was that he loves all of his children. Because I used to be so scared. Like, what if I'm not baptized? Does that mean I can't go to heaven? Like, am I not going to get to go to heaven because I'm not baptized as a Mormon? Because my experience here, and it's funny because my husband grew up this like neighboring city to me, and he has a totally different experience. But I did not have any friends that I was aware of. I'm sure some of them were, but I just thought everyone was Mormon. Like, that was the only organized religion that I knew. I didn't know Catholics. I didn't know that there was like other organized religions out there. Okay, I kind of want to specify that because to me, like, when I heard the word God, I related it as like, that's what Mormons believe in. And again, this is like shaping little Sydney because like this is like, you know, when you're little, everything's just so simple. Like, this is that. Like, there's not all the fluff that we have now, like, as we get older. And so I thought, like, in order to get into heaven, I had to be baptized Mormon. And so it was ironic that that was the topic of the day. They were talking about the kingdoms of heaven. And I don't remember verbatim. I don't remember exactly what was said. I just remember what I felt in that moment. And what I felt in that moment based off what I had heard, and maybe I was misinterpreting it, I don't know. Okay? I'm going to be very clear about all this, okay? Because I know people like to twist things online, but I just want to share the feeling I felt was that my parents were baptized and I wasn't, and neither were my siblings. We could not be on the same level of heaven. We would not be an eternal family. Like, we wouldn't be together forever. We'd be separated. And so when it confused me again because my dad's like, well, God loves all of his children, like, no matter what. And he made that very clear to me growing up that it's my choice. He and my mom both were like, explore whatever religion you'd like. You can go to church with your friends. Like, we have nothing against you. We want it to be your choice. If you choose to get baptized, then that's great. And so that idea of like perfectionism again kind of came up, right? That was just another experience. And it's just interesting because I started to translate that God, like the word God wasn't for me, which is really interesting. But dissecting it, and it's taken me a long time to get here, okay, guys? Like, I didn't just, like, know all of this my whole life. Like, this is the last 2 years of my life that I've been doing some deep diving and, like, figuring out where a lot of my my beliefs and, like, my inner talk comes from. And so anyways, this is... Let me think about where to go next here, because I could go a couple of different ways. this kind of leads me to when I went to college. This was a big thing that shaped my identity, like today, and I have been dissecting the last 2 years also. When I went to college, I moved out of state. And so I don't know if you guys have ever heard the metaphor that like Utah's a really big bubble because it's like sheltered, and a lot of that comes from like the Mormonism or like the association with organized religion. And I remember the only questions I would get, like when people found out I was from Utah, is like, oh, do you have multiple moms? Like the polygamy aspect, like FLDS maybe, I don't know. And then I was also kind of put in a box. And then when people would find out I wasn't Mormon, it was like a conundrum to them because they're like, wait, you're from Salt Lake, but you're not Mormon. But they still would kind of make those comments. And I realized also I was very expressive with the way I dressed. I wore a lot of color. I like to layer things. And I actually went on a scholarship for volleyball. I played volleyball my entire life, and I was not going to play in college because of a lot of other reasons that were messed up in my head of why I could not do that. It's kind of like proving again some things to myself that were a little backwards now that I've dissected them. And I remember when I was going off to college too, I was dating this boy and I had really liked him. We had kind of had crushes on each other since middle school. And it was interesting because we had this talk, we're about to graduate, and we weren't serious. Like, we never really got involved. We just spent a lot of time together. We had common friends, and it was never serious. I never we were never really committed to each other, but we were dating in a sense. And I remember having a conversation that I was like leaving out of state. I don't remember where he was going at the time, but he was also an athlete. And I remember him just looking at me, and he's like, well, so where do you think this is going? And I was like, well, I'm going to this school and you're probably going to stay here. So like, kind of like something along the lines of like, well, wouldn't we just continue what we're doing? Like, what would change? Like, I don't see anything wrong with that. And I remember him, again, the feeling is louder than like the actual words. He gave me the impression, because I don't think he actually said this out loud, but I knew his family really, really well because they were also in the volleyball world. And so I actually knew his parents, I knew his siblings, and I had known them for a long time. And so when we finally like decided to like date, it was really fun, but I wasn't Mormon. And so I remember the underlying feeling of why he didn't want to continue is that someone in his family, like his mom or either himself, had planted the seed of like, it won't ever go anywhere because you're not Mormon. Like, we won't ever be able to get married like in the temple, or maybe like I might serve a mission type of a deal. Because again, with the Mormon religion, at 18, boys can serve a 2-year long mission. And a lot of my friends, they were 18 when we graduated, and they got called to serve like almost immediately after graduating. And we would have these parties where we would all get together and they would open the envelope of where they were serving their mission, and then they'd leave for 2 years. And girls also have the option, by the way, in the Mormon religion to serve a mission, different age, and it's a shorter time period. But anyways, just a little side note there. So there was a lot of like intertwining in like my relationships and like how I thought about myself and like if I was a good person or not. Like, I questioned a lot of that, and Mormonism was just intertwined because it was just around me all the time. And I never thought about it because it was just normal for me. And then I go out of state to this other state that's very country. I went to Wyoming and I played for a small town. I mean, all the towns are kind of fairly small compared to like here, which Salt Lake isn't even like a big city, right? But Salt Lake's huge to people there, and they actually come here just to go shopping and things like that. And they'll drive hours just to go to our mall. And so anyways, I dated him for quite a while, a few years, and I didn't even start with that. Hold up. I ended up dating someone when I lived there. And essentially, like, I don't think I need to go into more detail than this because it was a combination of this relationship and me living in this state. But I started to like dim myself because I noticed how much I stood out. Like, I remember being made fun of or being told, like, yeah, we know you're not from around here because you wear skinny jeans. Like, skinny jeans were all the rage in Utah, okay? But like, boot cut is the only way to go there. But it was funny because there were people who wore skinny jeans, but like, maybe it was just like the city I was in. I don't know. You could look at someone and be like, they're not from here versus they are. And the irony of this, because I ended up getting my associate's degree there in like this new, what do you call it? Like a degree that had like literally just been finalized that year. And the professor was so amazing. And they called it human communication. And we talked about nonverbals and subcultures and cultures. And I was so fascinated, like so fascinated by this. And I would participate a lot. And I think our grade, it's obviously like a communications class, went off of participation too. But I would talk about the culture in Salt Lake a lot, and people were just so fascinated. And I brought up the whole skinny jeans thing in one discussion. I don't even remember what it was about. But I just remember people were so fascinated with the culture, and then like they would be so inquisitive about the Mormon culture too. And I was like, I am not the best person to talk on this, but yes, I was surrounded by it my entire life, and it still does affect me in certain ways. But like, I have learned that it's just a way of life here, and that I am not a part of the Mormon church, but I still belong, and I don't feel outcasted. I've never felt outcasted, even in some of those stories. That's why I was like, I want to be really clear that I'm just expressing like the way I felt was more confused. I never felt isolated or abandoned, which in telling the stories, I could see how I could have felt that way. And maybe there was a little bit of that, but that's not like the overbearing feelings that I experienced growing up around that culture. And so anyways, I started to dim myself because I noticed I stood out in this area and around these people, because I also liked fuchsia. Maybe it was popular back then too. I don't know. Like, I loved bright colors. And I remember literally walking in. So at the time I had like platinum blonde hair, and I wore the skinny jeans, and I would wear, like, I remember I had this like platinum pink windbreaker jacket. And I have this instance that I will never forget, that I walked into a gym, and it was the boy I was dating. It was his hometown, and his little sister was playing for her high school. So it was like their high school. And you know, small towns are ride or die for their sports. They really are. Even in the city I played in college, like everyone showed up. Like the tabloids, like their Tribune was all about sports, and it was like all the rage and all the drama, and everyone wanted to know what everyone was doing. And anyways, I remember walking into this gym, and I remember feeling like all eyes were on me, because I look up in the stands and everyone is wearing black and red everything, and just hoodies and pullovers and like super cash. Maybe there's some, I don't know, other shirts in there, but that's like what stood out to me as majority. And a lot of them had their like little city name on it, or like the high school's name. And I walk in, and I think I had boots on too, so that didn't help. But I had like these boots, this fuchsia jacket, and this platinum blonde hair. And I just remember like the whole stadium almost. And I think it was a timeout or something, so that kind of added to it, right? But I just remember them being like, who is she? Because it was such a small town. Everyone knows everyone. So anyways, I started to buy blacks and grays, and majority of my closet ended up being like all black and some grays and whites, and this has nothing to say like about Wyoming, okay? This has everything to say with me, about me. I hope that made sense. Like, I'm not bashing on Wyoming, or I'm not bashing on small towns or anything like that. I'm sharing what I did to see what, like my brain, how it conceptualized those experiences, and then how I reacted to that in that time, again, subconsciously, like not even knowing it. And then, so I dated this boy. So I went to this school. It was a 2-year school. I moved back home and I continued to date this boy. And I would drive and I would see him almost every single weekend. And I would drop everything and everyone. And I would go to see this relationship. And I was slowly losing myself because I was so like, I was living in like this different world, which was kind of his world, but I was in my own. And by the time that relationship ended, it was so interesting because my sense of self needed a reset button. It was so like, what word do I want to use? Like, it was like I kind of felt shattered, but not because of the relationship. Ironically, I was kind of shattered with my sense of self, I guess I could say. And I moved further and further into disassociation and further into like numbing out instead of like dealing with things. Like that relationship lasted a long time and I didn't even cry. Like I remember trying to make myself cry because I was like, we've been together for so long, and like the way it ended was so abrupt. Like we never broke up. He basically, I do remember his words here is he said, I need time to think, and hung up the phone, and we never talked again. And this is a man that I gave up so much time for and spent so much time with. And this is interesting. I did not expect to go into this relationship at all today. So getting a little in the nitty gritty here, but I think it really impacted me though, and maybe that's why it's coming up, is because I was trying to mold myself into what I thought he wanted when it just wasn't working. And I think in the back of my head, I knew it wasn't working. But like, I don't know if I was proving something to myself, I was proving something to him. I do know I was really in love with his family, man. Oh my gosh. Oof. I still have a lot of love for them. They're just good people. And I was really enmeshed with them in that situation. And everyone was shocked when it happened, like the family included, to where they were just like, whoa, like she's a part of our life too. Like what happened? And there was no explanation for anyone. And I don't know if they ever got it. But I think I never cried because I knew I was so far away from myself and that it wasn't right for me. I just needed a little bit of a push. And to this day, I always say, like, if he wouldn't have done that, I'd probably be married and I would have moved to his small town. I would have picked up my life and I would have moved there because I was doing what I thought would make him happy. And so I'm really thankful for that relationship and that experience. And okay, let's get back on track here. Wow. So I know that impacted me pretty heavy because obviously that was like my transition from high school to college, like being an adult. I am off on my own now in a whole different state. I am buying my own groceries. I'm driving myself everywhere. I am traveling every single weekend, Thursday to Sunday almost, for a volleyball tournament. Because remember, I was in the athletics department. And then we had practice every day. Like there was a lot going on. That distracted me also from how I was feeling in that relationship that I could hide in. And so when I go back to like real life, and I continued my college experience at the University of Utah, which is a big college here, and I had another part. This was an interesting transition for me because I felt like I was like, those 2 years, the first 2 years I was out of my household and like didn't have my mom to go to every single day. Like always been really, really close. I still say she's one of my best friends. She knows everything about my life. At that time though, speaking of knowing it wasn't a good relationship, I did not tell her anything about that relationship. And my family did not feel the way about him that his felt about me. And I ignored and ignored. And so when I got home, I'm like, all of a sudden, I'm back home and I'm like kind of thrown into life. I felt like 2 years went by that like really never happened. It was kind of an interesting experience. And then I went into prove it energy so heavily of proving myself. I don't know if it was to myself or it was to my parents, because my parents, I love them so much, and my family, we are all so extremely close. But they're a really big part of my story too that would give a lot of context. Like, so when I went to the University of Utah, I was in communication. Remember, I had gotten my associate degree there, and I switched to business when I went to the U because I thought that's a path that my parents would want me to take. And yes, there's some breadcrumbs and some comments being made that made me believe that. Whether or not my parents even knew they were consciously saying that, I did feel like I was being pushed the business route. They're entrepreneurs. They're very successful in their own right. They have earned everything they have, and they have hustled their entire relationship together. They have owned multiple businesses ever since they've been together, and they own several properties throughout like the Salt Lake Valley and Utah County Valley over there, like Happy Valley, where BYU is. That's why it's called Happy Valley. And they had a really handsome portfolio at some point, and it wasn't the only thing they were doing. So I had a lot to live up to, especially that they were self-starters. Like, they built this empire that I viewed as an empire. And growing up, I kind of lived at their office. I would go there after school sometimes. I would sleep on the couch in this room. I would play video games there with my brother. We had a set of toys and a toy box there because of how much we played. And then as I got older, my parents would give me money. I'm not going to say they didn't. But if I ever wanted to do something with my friends, they'd be like, "Okay, come into the office and file, or come into the office and shred and earn some money, and then you can go to the movies." And they were trying to teach me discipline and how to work for myself and the value of money and all those things. And I really do value that because that did translate later in my life, and I did work really hard. But so throughout, even maybe in elementary school, like I remember it was really cool to have my own money, and I would shred those days, like that's something anyone could do, even a young kid. And then as I came home from the University of Utah, I also had a part-time job with my dad. He at the time had gotten his real estate license. I think it was just the first couple years he had gotten his license, or since I had been home. No, he got it in 2009. So he'd actually been licensed for a while. But besides the point, I was doing a lot of his marketing, and that's when like postcards, and he would do a lot of mailers, and his niche was helping people get loan modifications and save their home that were in foreclosure in the crash, like when he first got licensed. And he really hit like a really, really big need at that time, obviously, because people were not aware that they had the right and they had an option to save their home. And so to this day, my parents are still getting referrals from the people that my parents helped save their home so they weren't homeless. And doing loan modifications, you don't get anything out of telling someone that they have an option to do that and hooking them up with like a lender. And like that's not in a real estate agent's wheelhouse. And so a lot of people that he helped, he never saw any monetary value from that. So he's freaking awesome. He's the best. He's also one of my best friends, by the way. And I'm sure they'll come up a lot. And I'm hoping to have my dad on as a guest one day because this is kind of his wheelhouse. They're both awesome. Anyways, and so my mom wasn't licensed at the time. So I was helping out my dad. I was in that office again. Then I get my first like real job because I've always just had odd jobs with my parents. And then I was a student athlete. And I get my first job, and I remember feeling like I was on top of the world, and I was getting my degree in business admin, and it was freaking hard because I really wasn't interested in the classes, and I did want to go the communication route really badly, but I mean, there's kind of a rep about communication degrees too, about like, you don't earn money, or like, oh, they're going the easy route with a comm degree. And that was very verbal. I don't know if that's just like my area or if like people experience that in general. But that was very much so like the circles I was around, I would hear that. And so, well, business, you can do anything you want, right? And so I get this new real job, and I remember I would work like when I had classes, I would work part time when my classes were getting heavy towards like the end of my degree, and then I would work full time in the summers. And I worked there a couple years, and I remember putting together this whole pitch for this boss, and he was a good friend of mine, like we were pretty close. And I put together this pitch on like how I wanted a salary, I wanted to go full time, and I kind of wanted to implement like something that they didn't have, because I was noticing their retention was crazy low. Like, and the turnover was so quick, and it was a sales floor. I never worked on the sales portion. I was always in like the back end. I always helped with like the financials and like invoicing and accounting. I was like the right hand woman of the founder's wife, and she did all the accounting and like the financial pieces, and I helped her with that stuff, which is so far from like where I am now, which is so funny. But I have attention to detail, and that's what she needed. So I was recommended by a friend is how I found the job. And I remember that they would have new hires, and they would literally plop them in a cubicle and just be like, okay, cool, you're hired, here you go. Like, this is how commissions work, blah, blah, blah. And then they'd like leave them. And they don't know how their phone works, really. Like, maybe they'd get a lowdown on their phones, obviously, because they had to dial and things. But other than that, like, they would just get thrown scripts. And yes, there was some training, but like, I had this whole like vision of like, if I could implement like the most basic of training, like this is how you turn on your computer. You need these things to function. This is what's expected of you. Like, if I could set expectations, I was like, man, their retention would be so much better, because these people are just so lost and so confused. And I would watch it, because I wasn't in the sales floor. I wasn't making dials. I wasn't on calls. So I would see how people would feel. And they would also come to me and my other friends that were in admin positions, and they would be like, so like, what do I do? Or like, how am I supposed to do this? And it was always kind of that, instead of like having like videos on trainings they could watch, or like a week long shadowing maybe. I don't know. So anyways, I come up with this whole implementation program in my head, and I go to pitch my boss on this, and I'm like, ooh, like I'm so excited, because this is somewhere you guys are really hurting. I think you could save so much money here. And I just got done with my ops classes and my accounting classes, and so I'm like hyper focused on like processes. And I go to him, and I research like what a salary for like someone with a degree that I have gets, and all these things, right? And I remember he laughed in my face. And he was just like, Sid, you don't get sales floors. A degree does not hold any weight here, and it does not essentially make you special. And I just remember being so like shocked and hurt, because I was so excited. I saw so much opportunity. And then I had this thought of like, holy shit, this degree means nothing for me. And I had been talking with my family about my job. They knew I was going to be pitching this, because I had just graduated. I like felt like I was on the precipice of like so much for myself, like with this new degree and getting out in the world and like putting it to work. And that kind of shocked me, and it was a crude awakening for me, because I saw a future for myself there, I guess. And I loved the people, and I put in my 2 weeks, like, I don't know how soon after, but pretty soon after. And he was shocked by that. And I was just like, I feel like you guys aren't going to give me opportunities here when I really clearly see something. And he was just like, we don't do training. Like these guys you don't work on a sales floor. You've never worked on sales floors. This is how it is. They get it. Like these guys skip from sales floor to sales floor, and it's the same gig. And I was just like, but there's so much more. Like, I see so much more. You guys could be the differentiator, you know, like, and that's why people want to stay, is because you make them feel heard and seen and wanted. Maybe didn't have those words at the time, but now looking back, that's what I saw. And so that leads me to having these conversations with my parents and them being like, come work for us. And me being like, oh my gosh, speaking of opportunities, holy crap, my brain went nuts. And we decided on a wage for me, like an hourly wage, which is so funny because I literally did not have a title. I didn't have job responsibilities, except my dad was doing a newsletter at that time, and I am the creative one in my family. Like, I've always been the creative one, and they're like, Sid can help with that and give feedback and design, and like, she's helped with marketing, she can do it. And so that was the only thing I knew I was going to help with, and that was like a monthly thing that my dad was producing at the time, and it was really awesome and getting some traction. And he is a very good storyteller, and he needed some help with the formatting. And so that was like my only responsibility. So since I was making, like, I think more than I was making at this other job, I up and quit. I go and work for my parents, and I had no idea what I was getting myself into, and neither did they. And this is maybe a topic for another time, because I could really talk on this. But essentially, like, working in a family dynamic and where I had gotten myself with my family dynamic was so, I don't love the word toxic, but that's what's coming up. Like, you always hear, like, it's so hard to work with family, don't do it. It wasn't like that. Like, we worked so well together, and we loved still being together. But there's a lot to unpack here and get into, because essentially I ended up working there for, I think I say 7 years, but it was almost 7 years. I think it was 6, just almost 7, and like 6.5. And for 3 of those years, it took me 3 years to quit. For 3 years, I had the thought that the only way I could quit was to end my life. And I'd never been to that place before. And that sounds so dramatic and so extreme. But I had taken on so much responsibility at this job, and willingly, because I knew I could do it, and being in that do it hustle energy that is very prevalent in the real estate industry, because my mom ended up getting her license a few years after my dad. So they were both real estate agents, but they also self-managed their own properties. And at the peak, they had 60 some properties, and after the recession, they had 48. At least that's what their portfolio was when I ended working for them. They actually sold a couple while I was working for them, but 48 doors, and that's not apartments. It's all single family with a couple duplexes and 1 triplex. And I ended up being the boots on the ground and managing all of those and taking on way more responsibilities than I should have, especially becoming a new mother. And so it got very dark for me after a few years of kind of slowly waking up to what I have gotten myself into. Like, I had kind of dug myself in this hole of grasping and taking on, or not grasping, like taking on and owning these responsibilities and making them my own, that I was the only person that knew what I was doing, to where that's why I felt like that was the only way out, because I was like, what do I do? Like, I'd be dropping all this on them, all this responsibility that they never asked for, that I created, like this storm, like, that I got myself in. And it very much started to feel that way after I had my daughter. She was born in December of 2019, my first daughter. And mind you, this is a few months before COVID shut down. And COVID shutdown was March of 2020. And I also passed my real estate license at 38 weeks pregnant. And it's a 4-hour plus exam. I think I took it in 4 hours. And I remember feeling so accomplished that we had to take bathroom breaks, but our timer would still go. And I remember I didn't have to take a bathroom break, and that was like my biggest accomplishment. Besides passing the first time, that would have been a nightmare, being 38 weeks pregnant. But I'm going to save that for another episode because that deserves more time. And this essentially, the disassociation, the numbing out, the image, like keeping up with an image of having it all together, was a lot as a new mom, and not even realizing any of this was going on. And it wasn't until I actually did quit this job, which I would love to tell that story because it's surprising. Like when I tell it, it's just kind of funny what it took for me to actually quit. But after quitting is when I went on what I would call like this spiritual awakening, where I realized that I had no source in my life, because my entire life I associated God with Mormonism, and that's not what God means. And there was this mentor that I saw that she released me of what I believed God meant by saying, my word's God, but you can put that, you can replace that with whatever feels good to you. You can use universe, you can use Mother Nature, you can use Heavenly Mother, whatever you believe your source is. Please put in place of God if it's not God. And I want to release you from feeling like we need to have the same words. And I can't even express to you like what a weight that was lifted off of me, because at first, hearing her talk and she was using the word God, I literally was like, whatever she's talking about is not for me. But it was. And I ended up joining her year-long mentorship. And that is quite literally the catalyst of why I'm here today. And until next time, I hope there was some stuff that stuck. Take what sticks to you and leave the rest, because I am not on here to tell anyone how they should do anything or that they should do anything. I'm not here to should on anyone. I just am here to share what stuck for me in my journey and kind of the unearthing that I've gone through thus far with all of this. Everything I went through, there's little breadcrumbs as to what got me to where I was when I mustered up the courage to sever my ties with my family business and go out on my own. And I'm hoping that it just helps you think. It helps you tap into your feelings and out of your head. And that's where I want to take this podcast. I want you to, hopefully, you can connect with yourself on a deeper level and just take what's